National defense spending approved on Capitol Hill. We're looking at the local impact in a conversation with Florida's former governor. U.S. Senator Rick Scott also explains his support for several of the Trump transition cabinet picks. While we know a new administration will take over at the White House next month, what are the implications for Florida, for governing, and for policy? We're diving deep with Chris Ham of This Week in Jacksonville. Thanks for being with us today. So the end of the calendar year always seems to line up with budgeting decisions on Capitol Hill. This week, I spoke with U.S. Senator Rick Scott about a variety of topics. For instance, he opened up about President-elect Donald Trump's cabinet picks. First up, I asked about the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2025.
Well, first off, just locally, we have a new child development center at the National Air Station in Jacksonville, which will be nice. We've got big pay raises for all of our military, but especially our junior enlisted. I remember when that happened to me when I was young enlisted, 18 years old. Nixon raised our compensation, so I was very appreciative of the way he did that. But it's like a 14% raise. But it's a significant investment, and it's a good investment for all of our bases and our military all over the world. We've got to understand that we're at risk. China wants to destroy our way of life. Russia's not our friend. Iran's not our friend. So we've got, North Korea's not our friend. So we have to continue to invest to defend our freedoms. So we've worked hard. I've continued to make sure we don't have Chinese drones. When you look at what's going around in the country now, we're worried about these drones. So I've gotten those for the federal government not buying drones. Now there's not going to be any new license of Chinese drones, any new Chinese drones. So we're starting to make progress there, but we still have a lot of work to do.
When it comes to defense, I think about the Florida connection for Michael Waltz and being appointed as National Security Advisor in the White House to President-elect Trump. What do you think about that? I know he's House and you're Senate, but obviously you know each other, and it seems like Waltz brings a lot of important experience to that role.
Great pick. That was a great choice by Donald Trump. He's going to do a great job as National Security Advisor. I saw him this weekend when Navy beat Army. So it was a big game.
Sound like a Navy veteran talking there.
Go Navy. But I saw Michael there. He's going to do a great job. And Trump has great picks. We got a lot of people from Florida. Marco Rubio, a very good friend of mine, is going to be Secretary of State. Pam Bondi is going to be Attorney General. So Florida is the epicenter of the Republican Party, and looks like it's the epicenter of the Donald Trump administration, with Susie Wiles from Jacksonville being the chief of staff. So this is an exciting time.
One of the things that people are looking at is that Florida connection for sure. And it seems like some of those picks you just mentioned, Marco Rubio, it doesn't seem like he'll have any trouble getting through the confirmation process in the Senate. How do you feel about Pam Bondi there? Certainly a different kind of pick than Matt Gaetz was.
Well, Pam's she's going to go through. I've talked to my fellow senators about her. We all know Marco, of course. But I've told her what a great job she did when she was Attorney General when I was governor. So she will get confirmed. Yesterday, I met with Robert Kennedy, and here's what's great about him. He's going to run the agency called Health and Human Services. And so maybe for the first time in a long time, we're going to have somebody who just focused on health, which is the right thing to do. How do we keep people healthy? So I had a great experience with him. He is going to make sure that we start talking about how do we keep people healthy. Part of it's our diet, part of it is our exercise, part is our medicines. He's also going to make sure that he's pro-vaccine, but he's going to give us better information so you can make an informed decision whether you get a vaccine or you give your child a vaccine.
The vaccine part is something that certainly the critics have focused on. Is that a concern for you at all? Obviously, just that polio vaccine, for decades, Americans have lived healthier because the entire country said this is important.
Well, Robert Kennedy is very clear. He supports vaccines. I support vaccines. But I think you should be making these choices, and you should be making choices about vaccines, something into your body based on good information. And there ought to be accountability for vaccines. And so I completely agree with him. I think he told me, if you look at his books, the first sentence in the book is he supports vaccines. The last sentence in the book, he said he supports vaccines. But in the meantime, in the middle of that, let's get better information for everybody.
Yeah, it's hard to argue with the notion, hey, let's get better information on whatever the topic is. Some information has come out on the Trump transition pick with Pete Hegseth. So you've said recently that you support the nomination here. Maybe explain that, because a lot of people are pointing to some of the kind of sordid details of his past and a lack of experience in leading an agency like the Department of Defense. Where do you stand on that pick?
Here's why I like Pete. Here's a guy that joined the service, right? He intentionally went when he knew we were at war. So he served in Iraq and he served in Afghanistan. He led troops. He knows what it's like to lead troops in war. He knows the risk of sending troops all over the world. He knows the risk of having to defend freedom. He knows families that have lost their loved ones. He knows people that have been injured. That's the type of person I want to run the Department of Defense, because I want somebody that's, before we send people in harm's way, they say, well, let's think about what's going to happen here. We're putting somebody at risk of losing their life. Should we be doing this? And if we are we going to make sure they have all the right equipment? And are we going to make sure they have the best people around them? We're not going to do this, say, oh, we're not going to have the best people because we're going to pacify all these groups. No, he's going to get rid of this woke ideology and focus the military back on being a merit-based system. If I joined the Navy, I expected everybody I served with were the best, not the worst, and they didn't get their job because of some woke ideology.
When it comes to the confirmation process, we know that the Senate Republicans have a majority in the Senate, but that doesn't necessarily mean that every nomination is going to sail through. Do you see any of these picks that you think are not going to be able to get through the process?
Right now, everybody I see that he's nominated will get through the process. And if you're nominated, the way that works, you need to come talk to the senators, tell them what you're going to do. But I haven't seen any of the Trump picks that I don't support right now, because, I think he's picking people that, are going to change the way the federal government's working. Here's the problem we all have. People do not trust the federal government. So what Donald Trump is putting together a team that people can start trusting, because they're going to give us better information and treat us like human beings, like we maybe could make a decision for ourselves. So they're going to give us better information about what they're doing. Like Christopher Wray at the FBI. I want the FBI to tell us, why did they raid Mar-a-Lago, but they didn't raid Biden's house, right? When you're the part of the government, your job is to tell your voters and Americans why you do what you do.
Senator Scott is one of the conservatives backing a two-step budget reconciliation process in order to enact President-elect Trump's agenda. That would begin, we're told, with a border bill and leave tax legislation for later. All right, much more to discuss as we look at the transition to President-elect Trump's second term and new administration. Chris Hand is going to join us next on This Week in Jacksonville. Stay with us.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville with Kent Justice.
And government law attorney Chris Hand joins us for the rest of our show today. Chris, Senator Scott, we just heard him. He got his partisan view on what's happening in these final 30 days of the Trump transition back to Washington, D.C. But let's spend some time there. America is Florida is what you sent me a message earlier this week. There is such a big connection between what the new Trump administration wants to do and polling people, leaders from Florida.
Well, Ken, and first of all, I think it's important to recognize the transition is a really important period in the governing process. We read a lot and cover the election a lot. And of course, also when President Trump is sworn in on January 20th, that'll receive a lot of coverage. But this transition period, making the switch from campaigning to governing, is crucially important. And as you say, one of the early signs that President-elect Trump has sent is that he wants people from Florida to serve in the administration. Obviously, Floridians have served in past presidential administrations. We're the third largest state. But it's really unprecedented seeing the numbers of Floridians who are joining the top ranks of the Trump administration. The Chief of Staff, Susie Wiles, who's well known here in Northeast Florida. Marco Rubio, Senator from Florida, who will be the new Secretary of State if confirmed. Pam Bondi, the former Attorney General of Florida, who will become the U.S. Attorney General if confirmed. Mike Waltz, Congressman from this area, sort of St. John's, Volusia counties, who will become the new U.S. National Security Advisor. And that's really just scratching the surface, Kent, of other appointees ambassadors and others. It really is an unprecedented level of Floridian involvement in a presidential administration.
And what do we take away from that? What's the message from President-elect Trump when he says, I want these people from Florida?
Well, it's not surprising in the sense that, of course, Florida is President Trump's political base. During his first term as president, he changed his legal residence from New York to Florida. Mar-a-Lago has been in the Palm Beach area, has been his headquarters for the last several years. So in the sense that Florida has very much become the center of his political universe, now that he's been reelected to another term as president, we've really become very much the center of the national political universe as well. And I think that's why you're seeing it. This has always been an important state to him, increasingly important in recent years as he's been a resident. I think that is to explain in many ways why you're seeing so many Floridians play prominent roles in the next administration.
I want to show some video here of a representative, Jared Moskowitz from South Florida. But Mr. Trump is apparently considering him to lead FEMA. And the reason we bring this up, because Jared Moskowitz is a Democrat. And that would note a bipartisan flavor from these folks from Florida that would be going to serve in Washington.
Well, and Representative Moskowitz has since said that he intends to remain in Congress and run for re-election. But just the fact that his name, Kent, was sort of mentioned out there again shows the importance of Florida. Of course, Representative Moskowitz also served as the Director of Emergency Management in Florida during Ron DeSantis' first term as governor. What's also interesting is that a lot of the Florida people on whom President Trump is calling do not come out of the DeSantis orbit. Obviously, Senator Rubio kind of elected to statewide office several times on his own right. For example, former Congressman Dave Weldon from the Space Coast area has been nominated to be the director of the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, which has obviously been in the news in the last several years a lot because of the COVID pandemic. So again, it's part of sort of an independent group of Floridians that are in President Trump's orbit, less in Governor DeSantis' orbit, but still a very large number of Floridians who are going to be part of this cabinet and other appointees, again, assuming they go through the confirmation process.
What is the impact of this? What is the domino effect, as you put it to me, because we know Florida's going to have a new U.S. senator, at least 2 new members of the congressional delegation. All of these pieces are kind of moving. What's the impact on Florida?
Well, what's interesting is we're going to see a lot of change in who holds governmental office for a different reason than we usually do in this first quarter of the year. Typically, we see election results be implemented, and we see new office holders because of decisions that voters made in November. This time, it's because of any of these appointments. So, for example, if Senator Rubio is confirmed as Secretary of State, under the Florida Constitution, Governor DeSantis has the ability to appoint a temporary senator to serve for the next 2 years until the next general election. So that has an impact. And by the way, if he appoints somebody who's an elected position, that will have another impact. One of the names speculated about is Attorney General Ashley Moody as a possible Senate appointee. If that were to occur, Governor DeSantis would then appoint a new Attorney General. We also hear the name of Lieutenant Governor Jeanette Nunez. If she were to be appointed to the Senate, he would appoint a new Lieutenant Governor. And again, we're seeing in other places as well. For example, in the 1st Congressional District, Matt Gaetz, after an unsuccessful bid to become the Attorney General, resigned from Congress. There's now a race of numerous candidates, I think 10 Republicans and 1 Democrat who are running for that. The leading contender is Jimmy Patronis, who's the state's chief financial officer serving on the cabinet. If he were to win that race and he has President Trump's endorsement, then Governor DeSantis would appoint a new chief financial officer. And of course, here closer to home, because Representative Mike Waltz has been appointed National Security Advisor, there is now a special election in January and then in April to elect a new member of Congress there. So we're seeing a lot of open seats as a result of these appointments, a lot of special elections, a lot of new faces in office. We'll have to see how this all plays out over the next couple of months.
You know, and it seems less likely than it did initially, but Pete Hegseth as the nominee to lead the Department of Defense. And then there was some speculation, hey, maybe Ron DeSantis is the person who would serve there. So the 3/4 of the cabinet in the state of Florida could be doing something else. Doesn't seem likely at this point, but obviously, as you pointed out, lots of dominoes that are falling here. So when we come back, we're going to talk about 2 other key elements to the incoming administration. We're going to talk about policy implication and the governing implications of what's going on here. That's next on This Week in Jacksonville.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville on Channel 4.
Thanks for staying with us today. Chris Hand is with us on a day that we call Hand on Government. And I think in this last segment, really want to lean into some of your expertise and experience here. The two topics, policy implications for Florida and governing implications, all stemming from this transition that we're seeing into the new Trump administration and White House in 2025. What does it mean when you talk about policy implications from Florida?
Well, Kent, one of the questions people have asked, sort of like you did in the last segment, is what does it mean that all of these Floridians are going into the federal government? Does that mean there's going to be some very Florida-specific type policy implications going forward? And of course, every appointee brings his or her own perspectives and experiences into the role they play. But I think what's largely setting the agenda in Washington for the next administration is what President Trump campaigned on. Issues like immigration, inflation, energy, taxes. What's been interesting is not so much in terms of people bringing Florida-specific policy ideas, but the alignment, no matter where they're from in Florida or around the country, that's occurred around the agenda that President Trump has touted at this point in the administration. And what we know about that so far, Kent, is that it looks like what members of Congress are going to start with. Obviously, the president has a few things he can do via executive order, but most everything he wants to accomplish has to come through the legislative branch. What we're hearing so far from incoming Senate Majority Leader John Thune and from the leaders in the House of Representatives, there'll probably be a couple of initial processes. Now, what they will do first is use what's called the reconciliation process. And the reconciliation process is a process by which a couple of times each year, the Congress can use a process in which they only need a simple majority in the Senate, 50% plus one, as opposed to 60 votes to pass any particular legislation. So it looks like they're going to split that into two bills. The first bill will be about the border, be about defense, maybe about energy. That'll be reconciliation bill number one that can't be filibustered, that they can get through the Senate on a simple majority. And number two will probably be either extending or making permanent the Trump tax cuts of 2017. So I think a lot of the activity we're going to see in 2025, both between the White House and the Congress, is on those two big bills that will move through the House and the Senate. And that won't be a slam dunk. Republicans now do have a 53-47 advantage in the Senate, but they have a bare 3-seat majority in the House. And we're already seeing the implications as it relates to this latest continuing resolution, debates over the budget, as to what that kind of narrow majority means for governing. So again, that's their plan, but the path to passing legislation never did run smooth, and that will certainly be the case in 2025.
You experienced this working for Senator Bob Graham and being there throughout this process. What does the next Trump administration really mean for state government, as well as maybe even local governments like the city of Jacksonville? How should people prepare?
Well, I think one thing that state and local governments are preparing for, there's probably going to be less money coming from Washington in the way of federal grants. During the Biden administration, of course, which was in the middle of the pandemic, there was something called the American Rescue Plan that really sent very large amounts of money to state and local governments around the country to make sure they were shored up. The American Rescue Plan is now over. Frankly, no matter who would have been elected president, that would have been over. So you're probably going to see less focus on cities and counties and state governments in terms of money from the federal government. There still will be opportunities, it's not going away altogether, but less of a focus. So at a time that's difficult fiscally for some of those governments, probably less help coming from Washington. You might also see some early skirmishes, particularly on issues like immigration. One issue that President Trump has talked about a lot are the so-called sanctuary cities, cities that, have declined to cooperate with the federal government or others in terms of deporting illegal or undocumented immigrants. That may be an early skirmish because there's been some talk among the Trump team that they might try to pull federal funding from cities and counties and states that don't cooperate with that. So
that's put pressure on those states or cities.
Yeah,
kind of
exactly right. And look, states and cities and counties get certain federal money every year from the Department of Housing and Urban Development and those kinds of things. So that's always been a lever that the federal government has had at its disposal and used at times. It looks like there could be some kind of early debate over that in the administration, but it's going to be incumbent on everybody, including Democrats, Republicans, to make sure they're building bipartisan relationships going forward, because obviously at this point, we've got Republican control of the White House, the Senate, the House. So if one's a Democratic local official somewhere building strong relationships with members of Congress, others in the administration, trying to forge working relationships regardless of party is something that's going to be important for everybody going forward in this new period, a period where there's going to be less money coming from Washington and the potential for some increased debate over kind of federal-local relations.
And Chris, I know we're going to run out of time soon, but Republicans have control of the House, the Senate, the White House, and they're still kind of sparring with each other. What do we see happening with the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, here? It seems like he's in trouble on retaining that position in the new Congress.
Well, nothing's ever monolithic in this regard, Kent. I mean, and we've seen this over the last year when Speaker Mike Johnson's been in office. A lot of disagreement among the Republican caucus on different issues. So in many cases, he's had to rely on Democratic votes. In this case, he had a 5-vote majority, rely on Democratic votes to pass budgets and that sort of thing. Well, when he's done this again here toward the end of his term, it created a real sort of debate that led to this continuing resolution being taken off the table. Expect more of that to come in 2025. Whoever's the speaker, now with a 3-seat majority, whether that's Speaker Johnson or whether it's somebody else, they're going to have a very tough task in making sure that all 220 Republican members stay on the same page to pass legislation.
Yeah, we'll keep watching. I appreciate your insights today, Chris. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken.
All right, so in our final show of the year next week, Mayor Donna Deegan joins us. What's her New Year's resolution when it comes to the city of Jacksonville? We're also reviewing the big changes in the past 12 months and the impact of those ahead. This Week in Jacksonville airs each Sunday morning at this time. I'm Kent Justice. Thanks for watching on air on Channel 4. You'll find us on the CW17 and then online at newsforjax.com or streaming on News4Jax Plus. And don't forget to check out This Week in Jacksonville Business Edition, our podcast episode this week. We speak with Tyler Matthews, the newly appointed CEO of England, Thames & Miller. We're discussing the firm's leadership transition, the role in regional development, the future of infrastructure consulting in Florida. Thanks for joining us today.
See why every day more people are choosing News4Jax, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.